This episode is made possible by our sponsor, Landmark College, the college for students who learn differently, offering comprehensive supports for students with ADHD and other learning differences, both on campus and online. Learn more at lcdistraction.org.
Hi everyone, I'm Alisyn Camerota, and welcome to this episode of Distraction. First, a trigger warning. Today we're going to be talking about suicide. And this is different for me because for a long time as a journalist, I was trained never to talk about suicide. I mean, the conventional wisdom, at least for decades in my career, was you don't really broadcast stories about suicide for fear of copycats. Well, it turns out that was wrong. And there's a right way and a wrong way to talk about suicide. And I have learned that, and we're about to talk about that. September is also National Suicide Prevention Month, so I'm thrilled to be able to bring in Dr. John Draper to the podcast. John has nearly 25 years of experience in crisis intervention and suicide prevention work. As he says, as you're about to hear, he's in the business of saving lives. Not the suicide business, the saving lives business. And he's the project director of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network. He's also the father of a 21-year-old daughter, and we spoke about the alarming spike in suicide attempts in teenage girls over just the past year, and how the pandemic and social media are affecting all of our kids' mental health. So, John, thank you again. I really appreciate you doing this. And I always look forward to talking to you, even though it's often in the worst circumstances.
Yeah.
So I'm doing this podcast on parenting teenagers. Mm-hmm. And part of why I wanted to talk to you was because I heard the alarming statistic that over the past, I think it was year or two, that there's been an alarming spike in suicide attempts by teenage girls. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to dive into that and see if you have any insight into what you think is going on and what we can do.
The subject is near and dear to my heart. I have a 21-year-old daughter myself, Alisyn. So this is something that we've been through, we've seen, we felt very personally in our lives. And as executive director of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, I see it and hear about it all the time. The statistic you were talking about is really interesting. I mean, it was really about emergency department visits, and the number of teenage girls that have been seen in emergency departments during the pandemic was about 50% higher than what was seen before the pandemic in 2019. But actually, it was specifically, I think, March and February of this year, which is an interesting time period. But I think what there's a couple of things to note about it. It's hard to know whether or not it's an increase in suicide attempts or just an increase in emergency department visits, because kids are around their parents a lot more now. The parents are actually seeing the distress. So it may not be that there is, and I think there is greater distress. I don't want to in any way suggest that there isn't, but there's been an increase in distress every year. The pandemic, I think, exacerbated it, and the parents are seeing it. They're right next to it. So we would have seen an increase like we have every year, I'm sure, this year regardless. I think it's higher because of the pandemic. The other thing I thought was really interesting about the study is that we didn't see the same number of emergency department visits from boys.
Yeah, what's that about? What is that?
Well, and also to be clear too, Alisyn, we didn't see an increase in emergency department visits for girls and young women over 17. So it's just that 12 to 17 age group of girls. And I know you as a mother of twin daughters.
Twin 16-year-olds.
Yeah. I mean, they're right in that, I would say, sweet spot, but it's not necessarily sweet all the time. It's tough. And it was very tough for my daughter and very tough for many young ladies. So it's actually been getting a lot harder over the years. And this is why, we can talk about the pandemic and its impact. And yes, anything that affects social connections of kids who are very much reliant on their peers and certainly girls are. And anytime that it also intensifies relationships with parents during adolescence, which is tough, those things can create more crises and stressors, no question. But every year we have been seeing, really especially since 2007, changes in the way young people have been impacted by mental health and suicidal crises, and especially girls.
I didn't know that. I thought that it was COVID related. I mean, I also think it's teenage related. I remember being a 16-year-old girl and feeling pain really intensely and thinking that it wasn't ever going to end and wanting a relief from the excruciating pain. But what happened in 2007? Why was that a tipping point?
Well, it's a really interesting question. It certainly begs that question, doesn't it? Actually, what we've seen is this generation, the cohort born after 1995, seems to be at much higher risk of suicide. And also, just to give you a sense, since 2007, things are pretty stable up to 2007 for adolescents and suicidality. And then they've gone up over 50% in terms of suicidality. Now, again, let's be clear. Let's not just talk about suicide. Let's talk about suicidal distress and being in crisis, and particularly girls. I mean, in high school, about 1 in 5 kids think seriously about suicide. So you're in your classroom, you're going to have, let's say you got a class of and that's in a year, a class of 20, so 4 of those kids are going to be thinking seriously about suicide in that classroom. And then if you count also attempted suicides, about 1 in 12 kids. So at least one of the kids in that classroom is likely to kill themselves. It's even more so for
try to kill themselves.
Try to kill themselves, yes. Attempt to kill themselves. So, and again, that's different from actually killing themselves. There's a much higher rate for boys to kill themselves than girls, but in adolescence, the boys are about twice as likely to kill themselves as girls. However, overall, in the general population of all age groups, boys are almost 4 times higher. So what we're talking about is a particularly risky period for girls in high school. They're more likely to think about suicide, and they're more likely to attempt suicide than boys, about twice as much. So again, this has been that case every year, and we've been seeing about 10% increases of suicidality, thinking about suicide every year for the last 5 years. So you asked about 2007. What's different about 2007? Well, let me ask you, Alisyn, what happened around 2007? What do you think changed around 2007?
Well, I had my son, but I don't think that was a nationwide crisis. So but I'm aware of that year because I had my son. So, I mean, those certain milestones, I remember well. And so, social media?
Yeah, well, that's unquestionably. And it's really screen time. It's not just social media. It's unquestionably, and there's been pretty strong research that links time with social media is affecting mental health for girls in particular. A lot of depression. We could talk about why that is in a minute. But screen time in general, I mean, what we're talking about is overall spending more time with screens than having really meaningful relationships with other people. And also access to information. If I want to get into trouble, it's easy for me to find it on the internet. I can get all sorts of information about it. My exposure to things that I would not otherwise see or be screened away from, I can engage very actively on
God,
screen.
It's just, John, it's almost so overwhelming for me that I have to turn away from it because social media and screen time isn't going away, yet it's this pernicious factor in our lives. And so it's just like you feel so helpless. And I in my, armchair analysis of this, it's like part of what as a teenager was so devastating. Okay, so when I was 16 years old, I mean, I just remember this so well. I toggle back and forth in my mind all the time between my 16-year-old experience, because I have these twin 16-year-old girls now, and how different their experience is on so many levels. Mm-hmm. In my experience, it was the breakup of, I was in love with a guy. I was madly in love. And when we broke up, I was in excruciating pain and I wanted the pain to end. And part of it is, of course, the public humiliation
Yes.
of the people knowing,
right,
and of being dumped, or whatever. And now that's like on steroids because of social media. Like everything is public humiliation.
Yes. Your personal information can become viral among your friend group instantly. And then, your so-called friend group, your Facebook friends, some of you whom you've hardly ever met.
Right.
And if you think about a lot of that stuff is going to be there forever. I mean, that's the other issue is it's not like people are they could forget about it, but it's still got a public record, in social media. So things can circulate. And that sense of it always being out there, I think, is also incredibly frightening and difficult for young people to be able to metabolize.
And so, since that genie's not going back in the bottle, what are we to do about that one?
Well, and Alisyn, this is the other thing is that for you and me, we didn't grow up with screen time, and our parents never taught us how to deal with the ready access to information, social media. So, as parents, we're just total knuckleheads in this area. Unless we, dive, of course, we're diving into Facebook, and all the kids are diving out of that.
Right.
So, they're attracted to apps that are just that we just can't keep up with. To me, there's a lot of things that we can do. I think there's things that we can do as parents and what we can do at home. There's things that we can do at school. And there's things that we can do as we're doing right now in media. And it really starts with conversations. And I think showing an interest in what your kids are doing on social media, restricting it is not nearly as important as doing it with them or being informed by them about their experience. The more we try to make it a bad thing and the more we try to cut it out of their lives, the more attractive it becomes. So in many ways, it's better to kind of have a conversation with them about cyberbullying, about social comparison, about what it means. This is the thing. The meanness, and again, the less involved a person is, or the less they can see them face to face, the less connected they are in their lives, or even a feeling of anonymity or distance allows you to say and do things that you would never do face to face.
Totally.
And so talking about that with them and talking about the impact of that, and that people who don't really know you might be saying things, and talking about how they can be good citizens on the internet and be helpful to others, that actually they're more likely to get help and get support from others if they give it to others. So talking with them about how they can be good citizens on the internet, and also talking with them how they deal with people when they're being mean to them. And also the social comparison thing. We all know that people's lives look so pretty in social media.
But how do you get out of that one? How are you supposed to unsee that? Like that's something that my daughters definitely deal with. Everybody posts beautiful shots of themselves. And that's what Instagram is, you know? So how are you supposed to be strong enough not to compare yourself?
Yeah, and boy, at that age, this is actually something that I did my dissertation on in graduate school, was the identity development of young adults as they were leaving home and going to college, and what were some of the things that could complicate that. So it's an endlessly fascinating area to me. And the social comparison issue is really about this major moment in our development. It's our second big period of identity development. The first one is when you're 2 or 3 years old, like, oh, I'm not exactly my mom and my dad, I'm this little kid. The next one is this period of adolescence where you start to ask these big existential questions. Not only who am I, but who am I in relation to this world outside of my parents? Am I loved? Am I valuable? Can I do things that make a difference or not? And so you switch your dependencies from your parents to your peers. They become incredibly important. they're the ones who are telling you, can I make it in this world? Same thing with your teachers, and some other adults outside of your family. So you're asking these questions: am I liked? Am I likable? Am I lovable? Am I smart? Am I capable? Am I competent? Am I perfect? All of these important questions are answered by others. Yeah, I've heard from my parents. They're my parents. But now it's the others that you are shifting your dependencies to. So now you just impose that in a social media platform. And those are now all of your others. Those are all the people that you are comparing yourself to. And it's meaningless compared to a conversation that you can have with somebody who might say, here's what I think of you. Yeah, why do you think of me like that? Let's have a conversation about that. But you can't see what they're thinking or seeing how they're relating to you. You can't ask them questions in an active dialogue. It's incredibly superficial and incredibly powerful.
Oh God, it's just making me feel so lucky. I mean, I'm nostalgic by nature, but it's making me feel so lucky that we grew up when we did, because, and also very lucky that I had the friends that I did and the boyfriends that I did, because I had generally positive reinforcement. Now, of course, there was tons of like high drama. I mean, as there always is, but like I had good supportive friends and I had, nice boyfriends, and that's so lucky, because if you have a shitty group of friends that don't show up for you, then, I'm sure you're really at risk. And particularly, as you say, with social media. And so how, as parents, I mean, are we just supposed to reemphasize over and over and over, like, well, how do we do that? I mean, what are we just supposed to say? What's the language we should use to protect our kids from some of this hideousness?
I think it kind of starts with, I like to have conversations with my daughter about, what she likes about things and what she doesn't like about things. So to get kind of what's her critical take on it. Basically, the critical thinking is what you're trying to establish, because let's also be clear that younger people until age 25, from a cognitive development standpoint, their prefrontal cortex is still developing, which means that they have a tendency to think in black and white. So if one person thinks they're crap, they think they're crap. If they fail on one test, it means I'm going to drop out of school and I'm going to be a failure in this world, as opposed to I got a 60 on that test. I'll get a 90 on the next one if I work hard enough. But that's so the critical thinking aspect of it is really important to engage them instead of you telling them, here's what I think is good about it or here's what I think is bad about it. Is ask them, well, what do you think? And then I can talk to them about this dreadful social comparison thing that we all are just oppressed by at that age, and also let them know. I mean, what is interesting is that if you look back on our development, Alisyn, where we are, at some point, the next stage of development is like, okay, how am I in relation to all of my peers? Do they think I'm cool? Do they think I'm not cool? Here's the ones who think I'm cool. Here's the ones who don't. And now I've sorted myself out into this group. But the next stage is, I'm different from all of those people too. Mm-hmm. And I can make my own choices. And in fact, I can agree with them, but not because I'm in that group, but because I have my own thoughts that allow me to agree with them independently. So that's the next stage of this, and reminding them that at some point, their peers aren't going to be everything. They're going to be important to them, important supports, but they're going to need them as supports, but not as people who will define who they are in this world.
Mm. One thing that I've been wanting to ask you, John, is that because I have had that 16-year-old experience where I was so depressed and wanted to be out of pain, and I've had it again in my 30s. So I can relate, okay? So I relate to people who get to that kind of emotional rock bottom. I know that feeling. Are there some people in your experience who don't have suicidal ideation, if that's the right word, or thoughts at all? I mean, because it strikes me that sometimes I meet these people, and they're friends of mine, mm-hmm. who certainly have had really trying experiences, as bad as certainly as bad as any that I've gone through. And they never talk about wanting to end their life. They never mention it. They never go in that direction. And I just don't know if they're like built in a more resilient way, or if there are just people whose brains don't do that. Have you, in your experience, are there some people who don't have this thing?
Yeah, I think there are. And the data is, you know, we keep talking about here's the percentage that have these thoughts and don't pay attention to the number that don't have. And there's not enough studies about resilience and, you know, what enables a person to become resilient in situations or be resilient in situations where others are much more vulnerable. We do focus a lot more on risks in our research, and a lot more on the problem, in many ways more than the solution or things that help people cope. You know, on the flip side of that, Alisyn, there's a whole lot of kids who have suicidal thoughts and have made suicide attempts who will not kill themselves. In fact, the overwhelming majority of them, you know, if you see how many kids are thinking about suicide who don't kill themselves or attempt suicide, the question that we like to ask them is, how'd you get through it? You know, to whatever degree are you willing to be open and talk about how you got through it, so they can model for those who are struggling and show them that there's a path out, because so many of these kids with their black and white thinking are thinking, this is never going to end. I'm never going to be okay. The sense of hopelessness is, you know, overpowering. But if they see somebody or others, a number of people who say, no, I was there too. While we can talk about resilience, that's interesting. But for us, what we want to do is get the people out of those crises. Or when they start to feel suicidal or start to feel they're in crisis, they can begin to say, so there is a path out of this potentially, that it may one day get better.
Yeah, that is so valuable. I think that. So this resonates with me on a couple of levels. Number one, I'm the mother of 3 teenagers, so my antenna is always up for any mood dips with them, or, you know, obviously stress or depression, anything like that. And then also, I vividly remember being a teenager, and I remember bouts of depression and not knowing what to do about that, and feeling like those thoughts would never go away. You know, when you're depressed and feeling even suicidal, you think that nothing will ever change. But it does change. And that's what you need to know. You can turn a corner and you can come out of it. I cannot thank John enough for joining me. I always enjoy talking to him. And you're going to hear more from John this Thursday, when he and I talk more about what we can all do to help someone struggling with suicidal thoughts. And please, if you are struggling, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, or you can go to the suicidepreventionlifeline.org. This is free. It is confidential support. It's available 24 hours a day. For Distraction, I'm Alisyn Camerota. Thanks so much for listening. Distraction is created by Sounds Great Media. Our producer is Sarah Gurton, and special thanks to Emma Marshall, Melissa Blum, and Caitlin Goldsmith.
The episode you just heard was made possible by our sponsor, Landmark College, the college for students who learn differently, offering comprehensive supports for students with ADHD and other learning differences, both on campus and online. Learn more at lcdistraction.org.